Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the heart of the Imperial Palace on Terra, where golden spires pierce the polluted sky and the weight of 10,000 years of history presses down upon every stone, there stands a hall of incredible significance. Within this hall, beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with murals depicting the triumphs of humanity's greatest warriors, stand statues of giants. These are not mere monuments to mortal men, but tributes to beings who transcended humanity itself, crafted by the Emperor's own hand from his genetic legacy. 20 pedestals were meant to hold 20 figures, each representing one of the Primarchs, those demigod generals who led humanity's greatest armies across the stars during the Great Crusade. Yet, if you were to walk through this hall, if you possessed the clearance and the courage to venture into these sacred chambers, you would notice something immediately disturbing. 2 of the pedestals stand empty, not abandoned through neglect, not temporarily vacant while repairs are made, but deliberately, purposefully bare. The stone upon which statues once stood has been meticulously cleaned. The inscriptions that once proclaimed names and deeds have been ground away, until not even a shadow of the letters remains. These are the plinths of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, known throughout the Imperium only by the haunting epithets bestowed upon them: the Forgotten and the Purged. The very existence of these empty spaces represents one of the most profound mysteries in the entire history of the Imperium of Man. In a galaxy where even the most horrific traitors, those who turn their backs on the Emperor and embrace the ruinous powers of chaos, still have their names recorded in the annals of treachery, these 2 Primarchs have been completely erased. The traitor Horus, who nearly destroyed the Imperium and struck down the Emperor himself, remains in the historical record as a cautionary tale. Lorgar, who first turned to chaos and began the corruption that would doom half the legions, is remembered so that his sins might never be repeated. But the 2nd and 11th, they have been subjected to something far more absolute than condemnation. They have been unmade from history itself. This is the story, or rather the mystery, of what may have happened to the lost Primarchs. It is a tale woven from fragments and whispers, from the few scraps that survived the most thorough purge ever conducted by the Imperium. To understand the magnitude of what was done to these 2 figures, we must first understand what the Primarchs were, what they meant to the Emperor's grand design, and why their removal represents not just a deletion from history, but a wound in the very fabric of the Imperium that has never fully healed. The whispers speak of tragedies so profound that even the loyalist Primarchs who survived the Horus heresy refused to speak of their lost brothers. They hint at failures so catastrophic that knowledge of them had to be scrubbed from every mind that witnessed them. Some say that what befell the 2nd and 11th was worse than anything that occurred during the Horus heresy, worse than the corruption of half the Space Marine legions, worse even than the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne. And perhaps most chilling of all, the few who remember anything about these lost sons suggest that if they had survived to see the Horus heresy, if they had been present when Warmaster Horus turned traitor, the Imperium would have fallen completely. What could possibly have happened to warrant such total erasure? What sins could have been so terrible that beings who were meant to be paragons of humanity, extensions of the Emperor's own will made flesh, had to be removed not just from the galaxy, but from memory itself? To find any answers, we must delve into the fragmented lore, the cryptic references, the carefully guarded secrets that have been jealously protected for 10 millennia. We must examine the clues left in the Black Library's extensive Horus heresy series, past the meanings hidden in throwaway lines and meaningful silences, and piece together what little can be known about 2 of the most important figures ever to be forgotten. The journey ahead will take us to the bloodiest battlefields of the Great Crusade, to the darkest moments in the Emperor's conquest of the galaxy, and to the terrible decisions that shaped the Imperium as we know it today. We will explore the most popular theories about what befell these lost sons, examine the evidence both for and against each possibility, and confront the uncomfortable truth that some mysteries may never be fully solved. But even in the absence of complete answers, the story of the lost Primarchs tells us something profound about the Imperium itself, about the price of the Emperor's vision, and about the sacrifices that were deemed necessary to ensure humanity's survival among the stars. So let us begin with what we know for certain, or as certain as anything can be in a galaxy where history itself is a weapon and truth is often the first casualty of eternal war. The Emperor's vision and the creation of the Primarchs. To understand the tragedy of the lost Primarchs, we must first understand the magnificence of what they were meant to be. In the dying years of the Age of Strife, when humanity teetered on the brink of extinction, scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, with no way to communicate or defend themselves against the horrors that emerged from the warp, a being of incredible power emerged from the shadows where he had waited for millennia. This being, known to history only as the Emperor of Mankind, possessed a vision for humanity's future that was as ambitious as it was ruthless. He would reunite every scattered colony of humanity, reclaim every lost world, and forge an Imperium that would span the entire galaxy. But the Emperor, despite his godlike powers, could not accomplish this alone. The galaxy was vast beyond comprehension, filled with hostile alien species, corrupted human empires, and dangers that defied rational explanation. To prosecute his great crusade, the Emperor needed generals who could operate independently across the galaxy, commanders who could be trusted with the fate of entire sectors, warriors who embodied different aspects of his own strategic genius. And so, in gene laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, surrounded by the greatest scientific minds humanity had ever produced, the Emperor began his greatest work. Using his own genetic material as a template, combined with esoteric technologies that blended science and what could only be called sorcery, the Emperor created 20 beings that transcended everything humanity had achieved before. These were the Primarchs, and each one was designed to be perfect in different ways. They were not merely enhanced humans or sophisticated gene constructs. They were demigods, beings who combined the physical might to tear apart tanks with their bare hands, with intellects that could outthink entire councils of strategists. Each Primarch embodied different aspects of the Emperor's own capabilities, different facets of what was needed to conquer the galaxy. One was designed to be the perfect diplomat and warrior, the natural leader who would unite humanity through charisma and military genius. Another was crafted to be the ultimate siege specialist, a master of attrition warfare who could reduce any fortress to rubble. There was a Primarch built for speed and hit-and-run tactics, one designed for void warfare, one who excelled at building civilizations rather than just conquering them. Each had their role in the grand design. Each was essential to the Emperor's vision. And for each Primarch, the Emperor created a legion of space marines, thousands upon thousands of warriors who were crafted from their Primarch's genetic template, soldiers who would serve as their father's army in the conquest of the stars. The plan was elegant in its conception. The Emperor would lead the initial phases of the Great Crusade personally, reclaiming the Sol system and the worlds nearest to Terra. As each Primarch matured and was educated in their role, they would be given command of their legion and sent forth to claim entire sectors of the galaxy in the Emperor's name. 20 Primarchs, 20 legions, each operating with near total autonomy, but all serving the same ultimate goal: the reunification of humanity under the banner of the Imperium. But the ruinous powers of chaos, those malevolent entities that dwelt in the warp and fed upon the emotions of mortal beings, recognized the threat that these Primarchs represented. If the Emperor's plan succeeded, if humanity was truly united and protected from the influence of chaos, the dark gods would lose their greatest source of sustenance. And so they acted, reaching out from the warp to strike at the Emperor's greatest creation. In a catastrophic moment that would reshape the destiny of the entire galaxy, the Chaos Gods tore the infant Primarchs from their gestation pods and scattered them across the galaxy through the roiling tides of the warp. The Emperor's carefully laid plans were thrown into disarray. His perfect generals, his essential tools for galactic conquest, were lost before they could even take their first breath in his presence. It would have broken a lesser being, but the Emperor adapted. He launched the Great Crusade earlier than planned, leading his armies personally while simultaneously searching for his lost sons. And one by one, across decades of warfare and exploration, the Primarchs were found on the worlds where they had landed as infants, where they had grown to adulthood among the native populations, where they had inevitably risen to positions of power and leadership. Each reunion was a triumph. Each rediscovered son a vindication of the Emperor's vision. Horus, found first, became the Emperor's favorite and was elevated to the rank of War Master. Leman Russ, discovered on the frozen death world of Fenris, brought his feral warriors into the Imperium as the Space Wolves. Robut Gilliman, who had already built a thriving civilization on Macraga, added his genius for organization to the Great Crusade. One by one, the Primarchs were reunited with their father and given command of their legions, and the Great Crusade accelerated to a pace that must have seemed unstoppable. But two of the Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, would never stand at the Emperor's side during the triumph of Ulanor. They would never lead their legions in the final phases of the Great Crusade. They would never face the choice that Horus presented to his brothers when he turned traitor. Because somewhere during those early decades of the Crusade, something happened to them. Something so catastrophic, so fundamentally threatening to everything the Emperor had built, that it required a response unlike any other in Imperial history. The tragedy of the lost Primarchs is that they were created to be perfect instruments of the Emperor's will, designed to lead humanity to supremacy among the stars. Everything about their creation, from the genetic template to the specific capabilities engineered into each one, was meant to make them indispensable to the Great Crusade's success. And yet, despite all that perfection, despite being crafted by the Emperor's own hands and imbued with fragments of his own power, two of them failed in ways that demanded they be completely erased from existence. What could cause such perfect beings to fall? What transgression could be so severe that the Emperor, who would later spend over 100 years trying to redeem his fallen son Horus, before finally striking him down, deemed these two irredeemable? To answer that, we must look at what little evidence has survived the most thorough purge in Imperial history. What we know about the lost Primarchs. When we attempt to piece together the story of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, we must work with fragments, with implications, with the spaces between words where truth hides in the silence. The Imperium's erasure of these two figures was not merely thorough, it was absolute. This was not a simple deletion of records that could be recovered by a skilled archivist or a persistent inquisitor. This was something far more profound, something that the Imperium rarely resorted to, even for the most heinous traitors. It was called a damnatio memoriae, or in the High Gothic of the Imperium, an edict of obliteration. To understand what this means, we must understand how the Imperium typically handles traitors and failures. When Horus turned against the Emperor and nearly destroyed everything the Imperium had built, his name was not erased. Instead, it was preserved as a warning, a cautionary tale of how even the greatest can fall. His deeds, both loyal and traitorous, remained in the historical record so that future generations might learn from his betrayal. The same applied to all 9 of the traitor Primarchs and their legions. Their heresy was documented, their crimes were catalogued, their names were spoken with hatred and contempt. But they were spoken. The lost Primarchs received no such preservation. Every statue was torn down and ground to dust. Every record was found and burned. Every witness who knew the full truth was either executed or had their memories altered. Even speaking their names became forbidden, an act that could draw the attention of the Inquisition and result in summary execution. This was erasure on a level that suggested not just punishment, but fear. The Imperium did not want future generations to remember these Primarchs as failures or traitors. It wanted them to never have existed at all. But perfect erasure is impossible, even for the Imperium. Fragments survive, hidden in the margins of older texts, preserved in the memories of beings who are too powerful to have their minds easily altered, referenced obliquely in conversations between those who knew the truth. And from these fragments, we can begin to construct a timeline, however incomplete, of what happened to the lost Primarchs. We know that both of the lost Primarchs were found by the Emperor at some point during the Great Crusade. This is confirmed through multiple sources, including references in the Horus Heresy novels, where surviving Primarchs speak of having known their lost brothers, if only briefly. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, specifically mentions that while not all of his brothers had met the 2nd and 11th, he had known them personally. This tells us that they were not lost before being found, not killed in infancy on whatever worlds they landed upon. They lived, they grew to adulthood, they were reunited with the Emperor, and they presumably took command of their legions. The timeline of their disappearance can be narrowed down through careful examination of the sources. By the time of the events at Monarchia, when the Emperor personally humiliated Lorgar and the word-bearers for their religious worship of him, only 18 legions are referenced. This occurred at least 43 standard years before the Dropsite massacre on Istvan V, which places it in the earlier to mid-period of the Great Crusade. This means that whatever happened to the lost Primarchs, it occurred relatively early in the grand campaign to reconquer the galaxy, long before the seeds of the Horus Heresy were sown. We also have evidence that both lost Primarchs participated in at least some campaigns of the Great Crusade before their disappearance. Most significantly, a recently discovered document that was accidentally included in copies of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer revealed that the 2nd and 11th Legions participated in the Rangdan Xenocides, one of the most brutal and costly campaigns of the entire Great Crusade. This campaign, which took place in the 860s of the 30th millennium, saw the Imperial forces facing an alien species of such terrible power that it seemed, for a time, that the Imperium had met its doom. Entire expeditionary fleets were lost without a single survivor. Worlds were rendered lifeless. Dozens of Titan legions were obliterated. And according to redacted sections of the official records, entire Space Marine legions were lost to the Imperium. The reference to lost legions in the plural, combined with the confirmed participation of the 2nd and 11th Legions in this campaign, has led many to theorize that whatever befell these lost Primarchs was connected to the Rangdan Xenocides. Perhaps they were killed in battle against this Xenos threat. Perhaps they were corrupted or infected by some aspect of the Rangdan's horrific technology. Perhaps they made choices during this campaign that the Emperor deemed unforgivable. The connection is too significant to ignore, yet it raises as many questions as it answers. From the scattered references in the Horus Heresy novels, we can also glean hints about the nature of what befell these Primarchs. In the novel The First Heretic, the word-bearer Argel Tal has a vision granted by the Chaos Gods, and in this vision, he sees the incubation pods of all the Primarchs before they were scattered. When he looks upon the pod of the 11th Primarch, he senses something deeply wrong, a corruption or damage that suggests this Primarch was somehow flawed or broken before they even reached maturity. The vision also contains the disturbing implication that killing this Primarch in their infancy would save them a lot of trouble and unwrite a shameful future. But perhaps the most revealing information comes from a short story called The Chamber at the End of Memory, which provides more concrete details about the lost Primarchs than almost any other source in the Black Library's extensive catalogue. In this story, Rogel Dawn is investigating a series of mysterious deaths within the Imperial Palace as the Siege of Terra approaches. His investigation leads him to a sealed tower, a place so forbidden that even Primarchs are not meant to enter. Within this chamber, Dawn encounters Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand, and one of the most powerful psychers in the Imperium. What Malcador reveals to Dawn is staggering in its implications. He explains that Dawn himself, along with Robuta Guilliman, had previously convinced Malcador to suppress the memories of all the surviving Primarchs regarding their two lost brothers. The memories of the 2nd and 11th, their names, their deeds, their very existence, had been psychically blocked from the minds of those who had known them. This was not done to protect the Imperium from external enemies, but to protect it from internal collapse. Knowledge of what had happened to these two Primarchs was considered so devastating that it threatened the core ideals of the Great Crusade itself. Malcador then does something remarkable and terrible. He temporarily lifts the memory block from Dawn's mind, allowing the Primarch to remember the full truth about his lost brothers. And what Dawn sees, what he remembers in that moment, horrifies him so completely that even as the memories begin to fade, he reflects that it is for the best that they remain forgotten. In his brief moment of clarity, Dawn thinks to himself that the truth about the lost Primarchs is so raw and hateful that if they had been present during the Horus Heresy, the war would already have been lost. He describes them as gone, and notes that their absence is a mercy. This revelation fundamentally changes how we must think about the lost Primarchs. They were not simply defeated in battle or executed for treachery. What happened to them was worse, more fundamental, more threatening to the Imperium than even the greatest betrayal. And whatever it was so terrible that even the loyalist Primarchs, who knew the truth, believed that erasing all memory of it was necessary for the Imperium's survival. We also learn from the chamber at the end of memory that the Space Marines of the two lost legions did not share their Primarchs' fates. At Dawn and Guilliman's request, these warriors were mind-wiped and attuned to new circumstances. They were too valuable to be discarded, too useful to simply execute alongside their gene fathers. This suggests that whatever happened to the Primarchs themselves, their sons were not deemed guilty of the same transgression. The legionaries could be saved, repurposed, their memories of their Primarchs scrubbed away so they could serve the Imperium in other capacities. This raises intriguing possibilities about where these warriors ended up. There are persistent rumors, hinted at in several sources, that the Ultramarines Legion swelled to unprecedented size around the same time that the 2nd and 11th Legions were expunged from the records. The 13th Legion became so large that it eclipsed all other legions, leading some to speculate that the survivors of the Lost Legions were folded into the Ultramarines' ranks. Others suggest they may have been distributed among multiple legions, with the Imperial Fists also receiving a significant influx of new recruits around this time. Whether this is true or merely baseless speculation, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that the Emperor himself personally purged the two lost Primarchs from history. This is confirmed by Magnus the Red in conversations with his brother Primarchs, where he states explicitly that the Emperor was the one who made the decision to erase them. This was not a choice made by the Primarchs themselves, nor was it a decision of the Council of Terra or some other imperial authority. The Emperor, who had created these beings with his own hands, who had searched for them across the galaxy for decades, who had invested countless resources and hope into their success, personally decided that they had to be removed from existence. The fact that the Emperor made this choice tells us something crucial about the nature of their failure. This was not a matter of simple incompetence or even treachery in the traditional sense. The Emperor had dealt with rebellious subjects before, had crushed countless human empires that refused to join the Imperium peacefully. had executed traitors without hesitation. But with the lost Primarchs, he did not simply execute them and move on. He erased them, and in doing so, he sent a message to his remaining sons that some failures were so catastrophic, so fundamentally threatening, that they could not be tolerated under any circumstances. The whispered names given to these lost sons, the forgotten and the purged, may tell us something about how each met their end. One was forgotten, perhaps because their fate was so tragic or shameful that it was deemed best to pretend they never existed. The other was purged, actively destroyed and removed, suggesting a more violent or deliberate end. Whether these names refer to different fates or are simply different ways of describing the same act of erasure, we cannot know for certain. What we can say with confidence is that the lost Primarchs represent a dark mirror to the Horus heresy, where the traitor Primarchs turned against the Emperor in a visible, dramatic rebellion that nearly destroyed the Imperium. The lost Primarchs failed in ways that were deemed even more dangerous. Their failure was so complete, so fundamentally incompatible with the Imperium's continued existence, that the only solution was to pretend it never happened at all. And in the 10,000 years since their disappearance, the Imperium has largely succeeded in this deception, creating a gap in history that has never been filled. The chamber at the end of memory. There is perhaps no single piece of lore that provides as much concrete information about the lost Primarchs as the short story, The Chamber at the End of Memory, by James Swallow. This narrative, set during the preparation for the Siege of Terra, offers a rare glimpse behind the veil of secrecy that has shrouded the lost Primarchs for millennia. To fully appreciate what this story reveals, we must examine it in detail, parsing every line for the implications hidden within. The story begins with a mystery that seems small in the context of the approaching apocalypse. Workers fortifying the Imperial Palace are dying under suspicious circumstances, their bodies discovered in places they should never have been. For most commanders, this might be dismissed as accidents or sabotage by hidden traitors. Minor concerns when Horus's vast armada is bearing down on Terra itself. But Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, and the newly appointed Praetorian of Terra, is not most commanders. He understands that the strength of a fortress lies in its details, that small weaknesses can become catastrophic failures when placed under siege conditions. Dawn's investigation leads him through the labyrinthine complexes of the Imperial Palace, through sections that even the Primarch has never visited, to a structure that has been sealed for decades. This is the Tower at the End of Memory, a place so thoroughly locked away that it has been forgotten by all but a handful of beings in the entire Imperium. The very existence of this tower is troubling to Dawn, whose mind is built for architecture and structure, who knows every corridor and chamber of the palace he is tasked with defending. That there could be a structure within the palace that he does not remember, cannot quite focus on, suggests interference of the highest order. When Dawn finally enters the tower, he finds it is not empty. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and most trusted lieutenant, has been waiting for him. The ancient Psyker knew that eventually Dawn's investigation would lead him here, to this place that contains truths that were meant to remain hidden. But with the siege approaching, with the very survival of the Imperium hanging in the balance, Malcador has decided that Dawn must be reminded of why certain secrets must be kept, why some truths are more dangerous than any lie. What Malcador reveals is staggering. He explains to Dawn that the tower they stand in is a memorial to the lost Primarchs, a place where the truth about them has been preserved even as it was erased from the rest of the Imperium. More significantly, he reveals that it was Dawn himself, along with Robut Guilliman, who had argued for this selective preservation of memory. They had convinced Malcador to use his psychic powers to block the memories of all the Primarchs who had known their lost brothers, to make them forget the names, the deeds, the very existence of the 2nd and 11th. This revelation is crucial because it tells us that the decision to erase the lost Primarchs was not simply imposed from above by the Emperor. The surviving Primarchs, or at least some of them, were complicit in the erasure. More than that, they believed it was necessary. Dorn and Guilliman, two of the most loyal and level-headed of the Primarchs, men who valued truth and honor above almost all else, had looked at what happened to their lost brothers and decided that no one should ever remember it. They had chosen deception and historical revision over truth, and that choice speaks volumes about the magnitude of what they were hiding. But why would Dorn and Guilliman make such a choice? What could possibly have convinced these paragons of honor that lying to the entire Imperium, including their own brothers, was the right course of action? Malcador explains that knowledge of the lost Primarch's fates threatened the core ideals of the Great Crusade. If the truth became widely known, if all the Primarchs and their legions learned what had happened to the 2nd and 11th, it would undermine the unity and purpose that held the Imperium together. In a time when humanity was conquering the galaxy, when faith in the Emperor and his vision was paramount, such knowledge could fracture the entire enterprise. Malcador also reveals that the Space Marines of the Lost Legions were not executed alongside their Primarchs. At Dorn and Guilliman's urging, these warriors were spared. They were mind-wiped, their memories of their Primarchs and their own identities stripped away, and then they were attuned to new circumstances. The exact meaning of this phrase is left deliberately vague, but the implication is clear enough. These warriors were repurposed, likely folded into other legions, where they could continue to serve the Imperium without the burden of their past. This mercy, if it can be called that, tells us something important about the nature of what happened to the lost Primarchs.
You know, after researching for quite a while, I've come to believe that the Lost Primarchs represent something Games Workshop got absolutely right. I know a lot of fans want answers, want to know exactly what happened, but honestly, I think revealing the full truth would ruin it. The beauty of this mystery is that it lets our imagination run wild. Every time I read a new Horus Heresy book, I'm looking for clues, connecting dots, building theories, and the fact that my theory might be completely different from yours, and we could both be right or both be wrong, that's what makes it special. Imperium erased them so thoroughly that even we, as readers outside the fiction, can know the truth. That's powerful storytelling. Sometimes the fear of the unknown, the weight of what we don't know, hits harder than any concrete answer ever could. At least that's how I see it. Anyways, back to the story.
The legionaries themselves were not considered irredeemable. Whatever their Primarchs had done, whatever had necessitated their erasure, the rank-and-file Space Marines were not deemed guilty of the same transgression. They could be saved, rehabilitated, given new purpose. This suggests that the problem lay specifically with the Primarchs themselves, with choices they made or conditions they suffered that their sons did not share. But the most significant part of the chamber at the end of memory comes when Malcador temporarily lifts the psychic block on Dorn's mind. For a brief moment, the Primarch remembers everything about his lost brothers. He knows their names, though these are not revealed to the reader. He knows what happened to them, though the specifics remain hidden, and he knows why they had to be erased from history. The text describes Dorn's reaction in stark, chilling terms. He reflects that what happened to the lost Primarchs is worse than anything that has occurred in the Horus Heresy up to that point. He thinks that if they were still present, if they had been around when Horus turned traitor, the war would already be lost. This is perhaps the most terrifying piece of information we receive about the lost Primarchs. Dorn is speaking at a point when half the Space Marine legions have turned traitor, when brother has been set against brother in the most catastrophic civil war in human history, when the Emperor himself is under siege on Terra. The Imperium is on the brink of total collapse, teetering on the edge of extinction. And yet Dorn, having his memory restored, believes that the presence of the lost Primarchs would have made things worse. Whatever they were, whatever they had become or had done, they were more dangerous to the Imperium than Horus and all his corrupted brothers combined. As the memory begins to fade from Dorn's mind, as Malcador's psychic block reasserts itself, Dorn has one final thought. He reflects that the lost Primarchs are gone, and that it is for the best. He gives the order for the tower to be buried, sealed away so completely that it will never be found again, describing it as only a tomb now. The implication is clear. Whatever truths the tower holds, they must remain hidden. The Imperium cannot survive the revelation of what really happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs. The story ends with the tower being buried beneath rubble and forgotten once more, and with Dawn returning to his duties, having forgotten, once again, what he had briefly remembered. But the reader is left with the knowledge that somewhere beneath the ruins of the Siege of Terror, entombed under countless tons of debris, lies a place where the truth about the lost Primarchs is preserved. It waits there still, in the 41st Millennium, a time capsule of horrors that the Imperium deemed too dangerous to remember, but too significant to completely destroy. The chamber at the end of memory provides us with several crucial pieces of information. First, it confirms that the lost Primarchs were not simply defeated or executed, but that something happened to them that was considered more dangerous than outright treachery. Second, it reveals that the decision to erase them involved the loyalist Primarchs themselves, suggesting a level of complicity and understanding that goes beyond simple obedience to the Emperor's orders. Third, it establishes that the truth about them is preserved somewhere, locked away, but not destroyed, implying that there may be circumstances under which that truth could be revealed. Most importantly, the story reinforces the central paradox of the lost Primarchs. They were important enough that completely erasing them required extraordinary measures, including psychic manipulation of the Primarchs themselves. But they were also dangerous enough that those same measures were deemed absolutely necessary. The Imperium could not allow them to be remembered, but it also could not quite bring itself to destroy every trace of their existence. And so they exist in a liminal state, neither fully erased nor truly preserved, ghosts haunting the foundations of the Imperium itself. The Rangdan Xenocides, death at the edge of the galaxy. If we are to understand what might have befallen the lost Primarchs, we must examine the Rangdan Xenocides in detail. This campaign, largely unknown to most citizens of the 41st Millennium Imperium, represents one of the darkest periods of the Great Crusade, a time when humanity faced an enemy so terrible that it threatened to end the Emperor's vision before it could be fully realized. And crucially, we know that both the 2nd and 11th Legions participated in this campaign, making it one of the few confirmed activities of the lost Primarchs before their disappearance. The Rangdan Xenocides took place in the 860s of the 30th millennium, during what should have been a triumphant period of the Great Crusade. Imperial forces had been pushing steadily outward from Terra, reclaiming world after world, bringing scattered human colonies back into the fold, and crushing any xeno species that stood in humanity's path. The Great Crusade seemed unstoppable, powered by the might of the Space Marine legions and the strategic genius of the Primarchs who led them. But when Imperial forces breached the eastern fringe of the galaxy, they attracted the attention of something that would test the Imperium's strength as it had never been tested before. The Rangdan Cerebvors were not a typical Xenos species. They possessed technology and abilities that seemed to defy the natural order, combining biological horror with mechanical sophistication in ways that suggested either ancient knowledge or corruption beyond human understanding. The name Cerebvors hints at their most terrifying ability. They consumed brains, but not merely for sustenance. They used the neural tissue they devoured to augment their own intelligence, to absorb the knowledge and skills of their victims, to become more sophisticated with every mind they consumed. An enemy that grew stronger and smarter with every victory was a nightmare for the Imperium's military strategists. The scope of the Rangdan Xenocides is difficult to comprehend. The official histories, even the fragments that survive, speak of losses that would not be exceeded until the dark days of the Horus Heresy itself. Entire expeditionary fleets were sent into the conflict and never returned. Thousands upon thousands of ships vanishing into the void, with not a single survivor to tell of what they faced. Worlds that had been brought into the Imperium were rendered lifeless by the Rangdan advance, their populations either consumed or transformed into something worse than death. Dozens of Titan legions, those walking cathedrals of destruction that normally turned the tide of any battle, were obliterated entirely. But perhaps most significantly, the histories speak of entire Space Marine legions being lost to the Imperium during this campaign. The exact phrasing is crucial here. Not depleted, not severely damaged, but lost. The redacted sections of the official accounts make it impossible to know exactly which legions suffered these catastrophic losses. But the timing and the plural use of legions strongly suggests that the 2nd and 11th were among them. What could have happened during the Rangdan genocides that would necessitate the total erasure of 2 Primarchs and their legions? The theories are numerous and disturbing. One possibility is that the Rangdan possessed some form of mind control technology, something that could override the loyalty conditioning of even Space Marines and turn them against the Imperium. If one or both of the lost Primarchs fell under such control, if their legions were turned into weapons against their former brothers, it would certainly explain why their existence had to be erased. The Imperium could not allow the knowledge that Space Marines could be controlled by Xenos to become widely known, as it would undermine confidence in humanity's greatest warriors. Another theory suggests that the Rangdan's brain-devouring capabilities were more insidious than simple consumption. What if they could not only absorb knowledge, but also implant themselves into the bodies and minds of their victims? What if the lost Primarchs were infected or possessed by Rangdan entities, their minds and perhaps their very bodies transformed into hybrid horrors that retained their Primarch's power but served the Xenos' agenda? Such an occurrence would be catastrophic beyond measure. A corrupted Primarch, combining the strategic genius and superhuman abilities of one of the Emperor's sons with the alien intelligence of the Rangdan, would be a threat that the Imperium could not afford to acknowledge existed. There is also the disturbing possibility suggested by some of the more cryptic references in the lore. In The First Heretic, when the word-bearer Argel Tal sees visions of the 11th Primarch's incubation pod, he senses that something is deeply wrong with this particular Primarch, even before their scattering by chaos. What if the 11th Primarch was scattered not to some human world, but into the territory controlled by the Rangdan themselves? What if they grew to maturity under the influence of this Xenos species, their development shaped by alien rather than human culture? When the Emperor finally found them, they might have been so fundamentally altered that they could not truly serve humanity's interests. This theory gains some credence when we consider that Horus, viewing the same vision, expresses a sense of foreboding about the 11th Primarch. The implication is that this particular Primarch was doomed from the start, that they would never blossom into what they were meant to be. If the 11th was raised among the Rangdan or heavily influenced by them, their ultimate fate might have been sealed long before they ever met the Emperor face to face. And when they participated in the Rangdan genocides, confronting the species that had shaped them, the conflict might have triggered a crisis of identity or loyalty that forced the Emperor's hand. The theory about the second Primarch is somewhat different. Various sources suggest that the second was found relatively early in the Great Crusade, was known to be quiet and contemplative, and possessed significant martial skill. The characterization that emerges from the fragmentary evidence is of a Primarch who was perhaps more thoughtful than many of his brothers, someone who considered the moral implications of the Great Crusade's actions. During the Rangdan genocides, facing an enemy that was both terrifying and arguably fighting for its own survival, this Primarch might have begun to question the Emperor's absolute stance against all Xenos species. What if the second Primarch attempted to negotiate with the Rangdan, or sought to make peace with a Xenos species that might have been useful allies against an even greater threat? The Emperor's policy regarding alien species was absolute. Humanity alone would inherit the galaxy, and all Xenos were to be destroyed or driven out. A Primarch who questioned this policy, who suggested that some Xenos might be worth preserving or allying with, would be committing what the Emperor might view as an unforgivable heresy. Not the corruption of chaos, which could corrupt anyone, but a deliberate philosophical rejection of one of the Imperium's core tenets. This would explain why the lost Primarchs had to be erased rather than simply executed. If one of them had openly advocated for Xenos cooperation, if they had made convincing arguments that the Emperor's xenophobic policies were counterproductive or immoral, other Primarchs might have been swayed. Horus himself suggested that Sanguinius, if he had turned to chaos, would have been favored by the dark gods, even above Horus. Similarly, a charismatic Primarch, arguing for a more nuanced approach to Xenos species, might have convinced other brothers to question the Emperor's wisdom. Such dissent could not be allowed to spread, and the surest way to prevent it was to erase all evidence that it had ever occurred. There is also the possibility that the Rangdan xenocides revealed catastrophic flaws in the gene seed of one or both lost Primarchs. The extreme stress of the campaign, the horrific nature of the enemy, and the psychic toll of witnessing such devastation might have triggered latent defects in their genetic material. If their legions began to mutate or go mad en masse, if the supposedly perfect warriors the Emperor had created began to turn into monsters or lose their sanity, it would represent a failure of the Great Crusade's fundamental premise. The Imperium was built on the idea that the Emperor's science and genius could create perfect soldiers to reconquer the galaxy. Evidence that this was not true, that even Primarchs could be genetically flawed, would undermine everything. What we know for certain is that the Rangdan xenocides were eventually won by the Imperium, but at tremendous cost. The Space Wolves, serving as the Emperor's executioners, spent years after the main campaign cleansing the region to ensure complete destruction of the Rangdan threat. Entire human populations that had been exposed to the Rangdan were exterminated rather than risk any contamination spreading. The campaign was so thorough and so brutal that by the 41st millennium, the Rangdan are essentially forgotten, remembered only in the most obscure historical texts. The connection between the Rangdan xenocides and the disappearance of the lost Primarchs is too strong to ignore, but it is also too fragmentary to provide definitive answers. What we can say is that this campaign represented a crisis point in the Great Crusade, a moment when the Imperium faced the possibility of total defeat. And in that crucible of desperation and horror, something happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs that required their complete erasure from history. Whether they were killed, corrupted, driven mad, or made choices that the Emperor deemed unforgivable, the Rangdan xenocides seems to have been the context in which their fate was sealed. The gene seed theory, flawed perfection. Among all the theories about what befell the lost Primarchs, one stands out as particularly compelling due to the substantial evidence supporting it, the possibility that they suffered from catastrophic genetic flaws in their gene seed. To understand why this theory carries such weight, we must examine how genetic defects have plagued other Primarchs and their legions, and consider what Sanguinius's fears tell us about the Emperor's response to such problems. The Primarchs were designed to be perfect, but perfection proved elusive, even for the Emperor's supreme genetic engineering. Multiple Primarchs and their legions demonstrated significant flaws in their gene seed, defects that ranged from merely problematic to potentially catastrophic. The Blood Angels, for instance, suffered from two related but distinct conditions, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. The Red Thirst was a hunger for blood that lurked in the hearts of all Blood Angels, a feral urge that had to be constantly suppressed. The Black Rage was even worse, a psychic echo of Sanguinius's death that could cause Blood Angels to lose themselves in visions of their Primarch's final battle, driving them into mindless fury. What makes the Blood Angels situation particularly relevant to our discussion of the lost Primarchs is Sanguinius's own reaction to discovering these flaws. In the novel Fear to Tread, Sanguinius explicitly states his terror at the possibility of the Emperor learning about the Red Thirst. He tells his closest companions that he will not be responsible for the erasure of the Blood Angels from Imperial history, and that he will not have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as my legion's only memorial. This statement is staggering in its implications. Sanguinius believed, based on what he knew or suspected, that genetic flaws serious enough could result in a legion being completely erased from history, and he specifically references there being a third empty plinth, confirming that 2 Primarchs had already been removed for reasons that Sanguinius feared might also apply to him. The fact that Sanguinius kept the Red Thirst secret from the Emperor for years, going to extraordinary lengths to hide it, tells us that he believed the Emperor's response to serious genetic defects would be severe. This was not paranoia or baseless fear. Sanguinius had some knowledge, however incomplete, of what had happened to the lost Primarchs, and that knowledge terrified him enough that he risked the Emperor's wrath by concealing the truth rather than seeking help. When Horus discovered the secret during a joint campaign on the world of Melchior, finding Sanguinius in the act of executing one of his own space marines who had succumbed to the Red Thirst, the angel made Horus swear never to reveal what he had seen. The implication was clear. If the Emperor learned of this genetic flaw, the consequences for the Blood Angels would be dire. But the Blood Angels were not the only legion to suffer genetic defects. The Space Wolves carried the Canis Helix, a genetic modification that gave them enhanced senses and strength, but also caused some to devolve into the bestial Wolfen. The Raven Guard lost several of their unique gene seed organs, possibly due to damage sustained during their Primarch's early attempts at accelerated cloning. The Imperial Fists lacked certain implants that other legions possessed. The Thousand Sons suffered from catastrophic mutations that threatened to destroy the entire legion before Magnus made his fateful bargain with the entity he knew as the Crimson King. Yet despite all these flaws, none of these legions were erased from history. The Emperor knew about some of these problems, tolerated them, sometimes even tried to help fix them. So what would make the genetic flaws of the lost Primarchs so much worse that erasure was the only option? The answer might lie in the nature and severity of the defects. One theory suggests that the gene seed flaws of the lost Primarchs were not merely problematic, but fundamentally incompatible with the Imperium's needs. Perhaps their defects made them prone to uncontrollable mutation, transforming Space Marines into monsters that could not be recognized as human. Or perhaps the flaw affected their minds rather than their bodies, causing a form of madness that made them unreliable or dangerous. A legion whose members could not be trusted, who might turn on their allies without warning, would be worse than useless. They would be a liability that the Imperium could not afford to maintain. Another possibility is that the flaw was not initially severe, but became catastrophic under specific circumstances. The Rangdan Xenocides, with their extreme stress and horrific nature, might have triggered latent defects that had previously been manageable. Imagine a Primarch whose gene seed contained a time bomb, a flaw that only manifested after decades of warfare or exposure to specific stimuli. Once triggered, the entire legion might have begun to degrade rapidly, with warriors succumbing to mutation or madness en masse. In such a scenario, the Emperor would have faced an impossible choice: watch as an entire legion transformed into something monstrous, or act decisively to end them before the transformation was complete. There is also the disturbing possibility that one or both of the lost Primarchs began to suffer from the same type of defect as their sons, but amplified by their Primarch physiology. We know that Primarchs could be affected by flaws in their own genetic material. Angron's situation with the butcher's nails, while not a genetic defect in the strictest sense, showed that even Primarchs could be fundamentally altered by modifications to their physiology and neurology. If a Primarch began to mutate or lose their sanity due to a genetic flaw, they would become incredibly dangerous. A mad Primarch, with all their power and none of their reason, would be a threat that few forces in the galaxy could contain. The vision that Argel Tal experiences in The First Heretic where he sees the 11th Primarch's incubation pod and senses something deeply wrong with it, supports the theory of a fundamental genetic flaw. If the 11th was damaged or corrupted even before being scattered by chaos, if their genetic code was unstable from the moment of their creation, they might have been doomed from the start. The Emperor might have hoped that the Primarch would overcome this flaw through force of will, or that it could be corrected later. But if it proved incurable, if it began to spread to the 11th Legion, the Emperor would have had no choice but to end the experiment before it contaminated other legions. The second Primarch's situation might have been different but equally catastrophic. Some sources describe this Primarch as quiet and contemplative, traits that might seem admirable until you consider what they could mean in the context of genetic flaws. What if the second suffered from a defect that affected their emotional regulation or their ability to form connections with others? A Primarch who gradually withdrew from human interaction, who became increasingly isolated and erratic, would be failing in their fundamental purpose as a leader and unifier. If this withdrawal was caused by a genetic defect that was beginning to affect their legion as well, creating space marines who could not function in the brotherhood that defined the legions, it would represent a failure that could not be tolerated. We must also consider the political and practical implications of genetic flaws severe enough to require erasure. The Space Marine legions were the Imperium's ultimate weapons, the guarantee of humanity's supremacy. If it became known that the Emperor's genetic engineering could produce such catastrophic failures, it would undermine confidence in the entire project. Other legions might begin to question their own stability, wondering if they too carried hidden flaws that could destroy them. Worlds brought into compliance might resist incorporation if they believed the Space Marines who conquered them could transform into monsters. The Emperor's response to genetic flaws in other legions gives us some insight into his thinking. He tried to help Magnus fix the Thousand Sons mutation problem, sending geneticists and offering resources. He tolerated the Blood Angel's red thirst, even after learning about it, presumably because Sanguinius had demonstrated that it could be managed. The Space Wolf's Canis Helix was apparently viewed as an acceptable trade-off for the Legion's effectiveness. So what would make the Lost Primarch's genetic problems unsolvable? The answer might be that their flaws were not merely severe, but spreading. A defect that affected only the Primarch and their immediate legion could potentially be contained through isolation or controlled deployment. But if the flaw could spread to other gene seed stocks through cross-contamination, if it threatened to corrupt the genetic material that would be used to create new space marines across the Imperium, it would represent an existential threat. The Emperor's entire plan for galactic conquest relied on being able to continuously produce new space marines from gene seed tithed from existing legions. If that gene seed became corrupted, if the flaw in the Lost Primarch's genetic material could propagate through the system, the Emperor might have decided that complete erasure was the only way to prevent contamination. This would explain why the Space Marines of the Lost Legions were not executed, but instead mind-wiped and repurposed. If the flaw was specific to the Primarchs themselves, or to gene seed derived directly from them, the existing Space Marines who had already been created might still be salvageable. They could be sterilized in terms of their ability to provide gene seed for new initiates, but still serve as warriors. By distributing them among other legions and forbidding anyone from using their gene seed to create new Space Marines, the Emperor could simultaneously preserve their combat value while ensuring the flaw could not spread. The most chilling aspect of the gene seed theory is what it implies about the Emperor's priorities. He was willing to overlook treachery, forgive rebellion, and tolerate significant personality flaws in his Primarchs. He gave chance after chance to sons who questioned him, who made mistakes, who even defied his direct orders. But genetic flaws that threatened the fundamental viability of the Space Marine project, those he could not forgive. It suggests that the Emperor valued the practical utility of his creations over their individual lives or identities. A Primarch who was genetically compromised was not a son to be helped, but a failed experiment to be terminated. In the end, we cannot know for certain whether genetic flaws were the cause of the lost Primarchs' erasure, but the evidence is substantial enough that it remains one of the most compelling theories. The fear in Sanguinius's words, the references to separate tragedies, the implication that what happened to them was somehow different from simple treachery, all point towards some fundamental flaw in their nature rather than a conscious choice to betray. And if that flaw was genetic, woven into the very fabric of their being, it would explain why the Emperor felt he had no choice but to erase them completely from history. The Space Wolves, the Emperor's executioners. To understand what might have happened to the lost Primarchs, we must examine the role of the Space Wolves, the 6th Legion, and their Primarch Leman Russ. Throughout the lore, there are persistent suggestions that the Space Wolves served a unique function among the legions, one that was both honored and feared. They were known as the Emperor's executioners, the legion that was called upon when other Space Marines had to be brought to heel. And if any legion was involved in the removal of the lost Primarchs, it was almost certainly the Space Wolves. Leman Russ was the 2nd Primarch to be found by the Emperor, discovered on the frozen death world of Fenris, where he had been raised by wolves and become a legend among the primitive tribes that inhabited the world. Unlike many of his more cultured brothers, Russ embraced his savage nature, incorporating the brutal warrior traditions of Fenris into his legion. But beneath the apparent barbarism lurked a keen strategic mind and an unwavering loyalty to the Emperor that bordered on religious devotion. Russ understood his purpose in a way that many of his brothers did not. He was not just a conqueror or a general, he was the Emperor's tool, to be used however his father saw fit. The Space Wolves were designed differently from other legions in ways that made them uniquely suited for their role as executioners. Their gene seed gave them enhanced senses that allowed them to track their prey across entire worlds. Their cultural emphasis on pack tactics and overwhelming force made them devastating in assault operations. Most importantly, they had no compunction about fighting other Space Marines. Where other legions might hesitate to turn their weapons on their brothers, the Space Wolves would do what was necessary without question or mercy. Evidence for the Space Wolves' role as executioners comes from multiple sources. In the novel, Prospero Burns, when discussing the inevitable conflict with Magnus and the Thousand Suns, a Space Wolves character notes that the task of Space Marines fighting Space Marines is not unprecedented, implying that the Wolves had done this before. The reference is oblique, but in the context of what we know about the lost Primarchs, the implication is clear. The Space Wolves had been called upon to destroy one or both of the lost legions. More directly, in the novel Wolfsbane, Malcador the Sigillite speaks to Leman Russ about the lost Primarchs, stating that they, unlike Russ, were disappointments. He says, "Your purpose is singular, and the Emperor relies on you to perform it. So many of the others have been disappointments. First those we do not name, then Horus and the rest, but not you." This is as close to a direct confirmation as we are likely to get that the Space Wolves were involved in dealing with the lost Primarchs, that this was their singular purpose that they performed without fail. In the novel Angron, Slave of New Syria, we receive another clue about the Space Wolves' role. Lorki, a legion master of the World Eaters, who had been interred in a dreadnought, speaks to Angron about the Emperor purging 2 Primarchs, alongside all the Space Marines who followed them. He suggests that if the World Eaters rebel, they might share the same fate. The implication is that there was a precedent for the complete destruction of a legion and its Primarch, and that this precedent was known to at least some of the older Space Marines who had witnessed it. But what would it mean for the Space Wolves to execute another legion? This would not be a simple battle where one army defeats another. Space Marines of different legions were brothers, united by their service to the Emperor and their shared genetic heritage. To turn weapons on other Space Marines, to hunt down and kill warriors who had fought alongside you in countless campaigns, would require either absolute conviction in the righteousness of your cause or the ability to completely suppress any emotional response. The Space Wolves, with their loyalty to the Emperor elevated above all other considerations, possessed both. The destruction of a Space Marine Legion by the Space Wolves would be brutal and thorough. We see hints of how such an operation might proceed in the burning of Prospero, where the Space Wolves nearly destroyed the Thousand Suns Legion. They struck without warning, with overwhelming force, aiming not to defeat but to annihilate. They showed no mercy to those who surrendered, gave no quarter to those who begged for understanding. They were the Emperor's wrath made manifest, and they pursued their task to its terrible conclusion. If the Space Wolves did indeed destroy one or both of the lost legions, it would explain several mysteries. First, it would explain why the Primarchs themselves are described as gone rather than dead. If their bodies were completely destroyed by the Space Wolves, consumed by flames or scattered across the void, there would be nothing left to bury or memorialize. They would simply cease to exist, which is precisely what the erasure demanded. Second, it would explain the thoroughness of the purge that followed. The Space Wolves, having destroyed the lost legions in battle, would then systematically hunt down any survivors, any witnesses, anyone who might preserve the memory of what had occurred. The years that the Space Wolves spent cleansing the regions affected by the Rangdan genocides might have had a dual purpose: eliminating any remaining Rangdan contamination while also ensuring that no trace of the lost legions remained. Third, it would explain why knowledge of the lost Primarchs had to be suppressed even among the other Primarchs. If the surviving Primarchs knew that the Emperor had ordered one of their brothers to kill two others, it would create a climate of suspicion and fear. Every Primarch would wonder if they might be next, if some failure or transgression might result in the Space Wolves being unleashed against them. This knowledge could destroy the brotherhood that was supposed to unite the Primarchs in their conquest of the galaxy. The role of executioner would also have profound effects on Leman Russ himself. To kill one's brothers, even on the Emperor's orders, would leave scars that no amount of time could fully heal. We see hints of this burden in Russ's character as portrayed in later novels. He is fierce and proud, but there is also a melancholy to him, a sense of isolation that goes beyond his chosen barbarism. He knows what he has done, what he is capable of doing, and it sets him apart from his brothers in ways that cannot be easily bridged. There is also the question of whether the Space Wolves destroyed both lost legions or only one. Some theories suggest that the fates of the 2nd and 11th were different, that they represent separate tragedies, as Rogel Dawn describes them. Perhaps the Space Wolves destroyed one legion in open combat, while the other was removed through different means. Or perhaps they destroyed both, but under different circumstances, one as an enemy that had to be exterminated, and the other as a mercy killing to end suffering that could not be cured. The Space Wolves' role as executioners would continue throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. They were sent to Prospero to punish Magnus and the Thousand Sons for their use of forbidden sorcery. They participated in the Siege of Terra as one of the most reliable loyalist legions, and in the 10,000 years since, their successor chapters have maintained the tradition of being the Imperium's most brutal enforcers. But the weight of what they did to the lost legions, assuming they were indeed responsible, remains a dark secret that even the Space Wolves themselves might not fully remember. In examining the Space Wolves' role, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about the Imperium. It was not built on enlightenment and reason, despite the Emperor's claims. It was built on the willingness to destroy anything that threatened its vision, even if that meant turning the most powerful warriors humanity had ever created against each other. The Space Wolves were the ultimate expression of this ruthlessness, the legion that would do what needed to be done regardless of the moral cost. And if the lost Primarchs fell to the Space Wolves' blades and bolters, they were not the last brothers to die that way, merely the first. Theories and speculation. Having examined the evidence and context surrounding the lost Primarchs, we must now venture into the realm of theory and speculation. What follows are the most commonly discussed explanations for what befell the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none definitively proven. These theories represent the collective efforts of countless lore enthusiasts to solve one of Warhammer 40,000's greatest mysteries, and each offers a different perspective on what might have gone so catastrophically wrong. The Chaos Corruption Theory. One of the most popular theories suggests that one or both of the lost Primarchs fell to chaos before Horus, becoming the first Primarchs to be corrupted by the ruinous powers. This would explain why their erasure was so complete and why knowledge of their fate had to be suppressed. If other Primarchs knew that chaos could corrupt even the Emperor's sons, they might be more vulnerable to corruption themselves, questioning whether their own loyalty was truly unshakable. This theory gains some support from references in the lore about the Emperor considering the possibility of chaos corruption. When Lorgar and the Word-Bearers were humiliated at Monarchia, Magnus mentions that the Emperor had contemplated erasing them in the same manner as the 2nd and 11th Legions. The fact that the Emperor would consider this as a response to religious zealotry suggests that complete erasure was reserved for the most dangerous forms of ideological contamination, and chaos corruption would certainly qualify. However, this theory faces significant challenges. If the lost Primarchs had fallen to chaos, why wouldn't the Emperor use them as examples to warn other legions about the danger? When Horus turned traitor, his corruption was not hidden but became central to imperial propaganda about the perfidy of chaos. Making an example of the first Primarchs to fall would have been a powerful deterrent. The fact that the Emperor instead chose total erasure suggests that what happened to the lost Primarchs was somehow different from or worse than simple chaos corruption. The Xenos Alliance Theory. Another compelling theory proposes that one or both of the lost Primarchs attempted to make peace with or even ally with Xenos species, directly violating the Emperor's absolute stance against cooperation with aliens. This theory is particularly interesting because it aligns with the Emperor's known priorities and the Imperium's rigid xenophobia. The context of the Rangdan xenocides lends credence to this theory. Facing an enemy that threatened the entire Great Crusade, a pragmatic Primarch might have considered whether allying with other Xenos species against the Rangdan would be strategically sound, or perhaps, seeing the sophistication of the Rangdan civilization, one of the lost Primarchs questioned whether all Xenos truly deserved extermination. Such questioning of the Emperor's fundamental policies would represent a philosophical betrayal that could not be tolerated. This theory would explain why the erasure had to be so complete. If it became known that a Primarch had advocated for Xenos cooperation and made convincing arguments for it, other Primarchs might begin to question the xenophobic policies themselves. The Emperor's vision of a galaxy belonging solely to humanity would be undermined if his own sons began to doubt its wisdom. Erasure would be necessary not to punish the lost Primarchs, but to prevent their ideas from spreading. However, this theory struggles to explain why Dawn would consider their presence during the Horus heresy to be worse than the heresy itself. Philosophical disagreements, while serious, would not necessarily make the Imperium's military situation worse. Unless the lost Primarchs had managed to establish powerful Xenos alliances that would have aided Horus, their mere existence should not have been catastrophic enough to warrant the level of horror Dawn expresses. The mind control theory. Given the Rangdan's apparent ability to consume and control minds, a popular theory suggests that one or both of the lost Primarchs were infected or controlled by Rangdan neural parasites or technology. This would create an enemy that looked like a Primarch, possessed a Primarch's abilities, but served a Xenos agenda. Such an abomination would need to be destroyed immediately and thoroughly, with all evidence of its existence erased lest it inspire terror throughout the legions. This theory aligns well with the few facts we have. The lost Primarchs participated in the Rangdan xenocides, where they would have been exposed to the Rangdan's mind-affecting abilities. If the Rangdan could control even a Primarch, It would represent a threat that the Imperium had never faced before and could not afford to acknowledge existed. The complete destruction of the controlled Primarch and the suppression of all knowledge about the incident would be necessary to prevent panic and to deny the Rangdan the propaganda victory of having corrupted one of the Emperor's sons. The vision of the 11th Primarch in the First Heretic supports this theory to some extent. If the 11th was scattered to Rangdan territory and grew up under their influence, they might have been subtly controlled or programmed from infancy, their development shaped by Xenos rather than human culture. When they were finally found and participated in the Xenocides, the conflict might have triggered deeper programming or revealed the extent of their corruption. Yet this theory also has weaknesses. If the Primarch was completely controlled by the Rangdan, they would essentially be a puppet. And it is unclear why knowledge of a puppeted Primarch would be more damaging than knowledge of a traitorous one. Additionally, the Imperium has faced and acknowledged other forms of mind control without resorting to complete historical erasure, suggesting that something more complex was at play. The forbidden knowledge theory. Some theorists propose that one or both of the lost Primarchs discovered truths about the warp, chaos, or the Emperor's own nature that were so dangerous that they had to be silenced. This theory draws on the importance of secrets in the Warhammer 40,000 universe and the Emperor's desperate attempt to hide the existence of chaos from humanity. If a Primarch discovered the true nature of the warp and attempted to share that knowledge with their brothers or their legion, it could undermine the Emperor's entire strategy. Magnus the Red was punished severely for his unauthorized use of warp-based powers and his attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus using those powers. If the lost Primarchs went even further, perhaps attempting to expose the Emperor's own connections to the warp or revealing truths that would make humanity more vulnerable to chaos corruption, their removal would be necessary to preserve the lie that kept the Imperium safe. This theory could also explain why their erasure had to be so thorough. Ideas once spoken can spread like wildfire. If the lost Primarchs had shared their forbidden knowledge with their legions or with other Primarchs, those who heard it would need to have their memories suppressed or be eliminated. The mind-wiping of the surviving legionaries and the psychic blocks placed on the Primarchs fit perfectly with this scenario. The weakness of this theory lies in its assumption that the Emperor would value secrecy over the utility of the Primarchs. While the Emperor certainly kept many secrets, he also demonstrated pragmatism in his handling of problems. It seems unlikely that he would completely erase two of his most valuable generals over information that could potentially be contained through other means. The composite theory. Perhaps the most sophisticated approach recognizes that the 2nd and 11th Primarchs might have met different fates that both required erasure, but for different reasons. Rogel Dawn specifically refers to separate tragedies, suggesting that what happened to each was distinct. Some theorists propose that one might have fallen to genetic flaws, while the other was corrupted by Xenos influence. Or perhaps one questioned the Emperor's policies, while the other was killed in battle, but under circumstances that had to be hidden. This approach has the advantage of explaining why both Primarchs are mentioned together despite having had separate fates. It also accounts for the different epithets. The Forgotten and the Purged might refer to different methods of removal. One Primarch might have been forgotten because their failure was so tragic that remembering it was too painful, while the other was actively purged because they represented an active threat. The composite theory could reconcile many of the apparent contradictions in the lore. The genetic flaw that doomed one Primarch would explain Sanguinius's fear, while the ideological or corruption-based failure of the other would explain why the Emperor felt erasure was necessary. Both fates would be considered worse than simple treachery because they represented failures in the fundamental design of the Primarchs, rather than conscious choices to betray. The Primarch-specific theories. Some theories attempt to distinguish between what happened to the 2nd and the 11th, based on the fragmentary evidence about each. The 2nd is sometimes characterized as having been found early, being quiet and contemplative, and possessing great martial skill. This has led some to theorize that the second was the samurai Primarch, drawing on Eastern warrior traditions, who perhaps developed a philosophy incompatible with the Emperor's vision. The 11th, based on the vision in The First Heretic, suggesting something was wrong with them from the beginning, is often theorized to have suffered from fundamental genetic or developmental problems. Perhaps their incubation pod was damaged during the scattering, leaving them mentally or physically impaired, or perhaps they were scattered to such a hostile environment that they were fundamentally altered by their upbringing. These Primarch-specific theories allow for nuanced interpretations that account for the different scraps of evidence about each, but they remain highly speculative and often contradictory. The surviving legionaries. Where did they go? One of the most intriguing revelations from the chamber at the end of memory is that the Space Marines of the Lost Legions were not destroyed alongside their Primarchs. According to Malcador, at the urging of Rogel Dawn and Reboot Guilliman, these warriors were mind-wiped and attuned to new circumstances. This raises fascinating questions about what happened to potentially tens of thousands of Space Marines who had served the 2nd and 11th Legions. The process of mind-wiping and repurposing Space Marines on such a scale would have been an enormous undertaking. Each warrior would need to have their memories of their Primarch, their Legion's identity, and their previous service carefully removed while preserving their combat training and conditioning. This would require psychic intervention on a massive scale, likely coordinated by Malcador himself, with assistance from other powerful psychers within the Imperium. The logistics alone would be staggering. But where did these mind-wiped Space Marines go? The most popular theory, supported by circumstantial evidence, is that they were folded into the Ultramarines, and possibly the Imperial Fists. This theory is based on observations about the size of these legions during the Great Crusade. The Ultramarines, in particular, swelled to unprecedented size around the same time that the Lost Legions disappeared, becoming larger than any other legion by a significant margin. The timing is suggestive. If the Lost Primarchs were erased somewhere in the mid-period of the Great Crusade, and the Ultramarines experienced their dramatic expansion around the same time, it would make sense that the two events were connected. Tens of thousands of Space Marines from the 2nd and 11th Legions could easily account for the Ultramarines' unusual size. Additionally, Reboot Guilliman's involvement in the decision to preserve the legionaries would explain why his legion might have received a significant portion of them. The Imperial Fists are another candidate for receiving Lost Legion Space Marines. Rogel Dawn's role in arguing for the preservation of these warriors, combined with the notable size of the 7th Legion, suggests that they too might have integrated survivors from the Lost Legions. The practical advantages would be obvious. The Imperial Fists, like the Ultramarines, were known for their organizational excellence and ability to integrate new recruits efficiently. However, the theory of redistribution into existing legions faces some challenges. Space Marines are not just soldiers. They are products of their legion's culture, trained in specific tactics, indoctrinated with particular values, and bound by brotherhood to their fellow warriors. Even with memory wiping, the behavioral patterns and tactical preferences instilled during their initial training would remain. Integrating them into new legions with different cultures and methodologies would not be seamless. There is also the question of gene seed. Each Space Marine's gene seed is derived from their Primarch, and this genetic material is what allows the creation of new Space Marines. If the Lost Legion's Space Marines were integrated into other legions, what happened to their gene seed? The most logical answer is that it was harvested but not used for creating new initiates. The existing warriors could serve out their lives, but their genetic legacy would end with them, ensuring that whatever flaws or problems plagued the Lost Primarchs would not propagate through future generations. Some theories propose that the Lost Legion Space Marines were not distributed evenly among the Loyalist legions, but were instead concentrated in specific chapters or companies within the receiving legions. This would allow for better oversight and control, while minimizing the cultural contamination of spreading warriors with unknown loyalty throughout multiple legions. If this approach was taken, there might be entire chapters of Ultramarines or Imperial Fists that are, unknowingly, composed primarily of warriors who once served the Lost Primarchs. Another possibility is that at least some of the Lost Legion Space Marines were formed into new chapters or formations under different names and identities. This would allow the Imperium to preserve their combat effectiveness while completely severing their connection to their original legions. These theoretical chapters would have no knowledge of their true origins, believing themselves to be descended from whatever Primarch's gene seed they were told they carried. The mind-wiping process itself raises ethical questions that the Imperium, with its utilitarian philosophy, would likely ignore. These warriors had fought for decades, perhaps even a century or more, building bonds of brotherhood with their fellow legionaries, serving their Primarch with absolute loyalty, and creating identities centered on their legion. To have all of that stripped away, to wake up with false memories or gaps in their recollection, to be told they belong to a different legion entirely, would be a violation of identity so profound that it borders on a form of death. Some Space Marines might have resisted the mind-wiping, their superhuman constitutions and mental conditioning making it difficult for even Malcador to completely alter their memories. These individuals would need to be handled separately, possibly through execution or permanent imprisonment. The fact that the law does not mention any such resistance suggests either that the mind-wiping was completely successful or that any failures were themselves erased from history. The impact on the receiving legions should not be underestimated. Even if the arriving Space Marines had no memory of their previous service, they would bring with them unconscious habits, tactical preferences, and ways of thinking shaped by their original training. Over time, these influences might subtly change the legions that absorbed them, introducing new approaches to warfare or different cultural elements. If this occurred in the Ultramarines, it might partially explain their renowned versatility and adaptability, as they would have integrated warriors trained in multiple different legion traditions. There is also the psychological burden on those who knew the truth. Robert Guilliman and Rogel Dawn, who argued for preserving the lost legionaries, would have had to live with the knowledge that thousands of their own Space Marines were not originally from their legions. Every time they looked at their forces, they would see warriors whose true identities had been stolen, whose memories had been altered, who served under false pretenses. For Primarchs who valued honor and truth as Guilliman and Dawn did, this must have been a heavy burden to bear. In the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, the descendants of these mind-wiped Space Marines, if any still exist, would have no idea of their true heritage. If Lost Legion warriors were integrated into the Ultramarines, then every chapter descended from the Ultramarines gene seed potentially carries some genetic legacy of the Lost Primarchs. The Nova Marines, the Genesis chapter, the Silver Skulls, all the proud successors of Guilliman's line might unknowingly include genetic material from the 2nd or 11th Primarchs. This creates a fascinating irony. The Lost Primarchs were erased from history so completely that they are known only by their absence. But if their gene seed lives on in successor chapters, if their tactical doctrines influence the legions that absorbed their warriors, then they have achieved a strange kind of immortality. They survive not as individuals or even as legends, but as anonymous influences woven into the fabric of the Adeptus Astartes. Their names are forgotten, but their legacy, diluted and disguised, might still shape the Imperium's greatest warriors, 10 millennia after their erasure. The real-world mystery, why they exist. To fully understand the Lost Primarchs, we must step outside the fiction and examine why Games Workshop created this mystery in the first place. The decision to include 2 missing Primarchs in the lore was not accidental or arbitrary. It was a deliberate choice made by Rick Priestley and the other architects of Warhammer 40,000's early setting, and understanding their reasoning provides important context for how we should think about these missing figures. Rick Priestley, who originally conceived and wrote the early background for the Horus Heresy, created the Lost Primarchs and their legions, specifically, to give the story some kind of deep background, unknowable 10,000-year-old mysteries, stuff that begs questions, for which there could be no answer. This was not about creating a mystery that would eventually be solved. It was about creating the sense that the Warhammer 40,000 universe was vast and ancient enough to contain genuinely unknowable elements, secrets so old and so thoroughly buried that they could never be fully recovered. The inspiration for this concept came from Roman history. The Roman military had legions that were completely destroyed and whose numbers were never used again out of shame or superstition. The most famous example is the loss of 3 legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus in the Teutoburg forest, a catastrophic defeat that led to the retirement of those legions' numbers from active use. The Romans, like the fictional Imperium, chose to deal with certain failures through a form of historical erasure, refusing to speak of or commemorate defeats that were too painful or embarrassing to acknowledge. This historical parallel is important because it suggests that the Lost Primarchs were never meant to be a puzzle with a definitive solution. They were meant to evoke the feeling of encountering a genuine historical gap, something that time and deliberate destruction have rendered permanently unknowable. In real history, we will never know exactly what happened during certain periods or events, because the records were destroyed or never made in the first place. The Lost Primarchs were meant to import that same sense of frustrating incompleteness into the Warhammer 40,000 setting. For many years, fans believed that the Lost Legions existed primarily to give players creative freedom. The thinking was that if 2 of the 20 legions were undefined, players could create their own custom Space Marine legions or chapters and claim they were descended from or related to these Lost Primarchs. This would allow for maximum player creativity while still fitting within the established lore. When Rick Priestley was told that this was why most fans thought the Lost Legions existed, his response was revealing. "I created 1,000 chapters, of which we only gave details of a dozen or so there were 900 odd chapters left blank for people to fill in." In other words, players already had nearly infinite creative freedom to create custom chapters without needing the Lost Legions as justification. The Lost Primarchs served a different narrative purpose. They existed to create mystery, to add depth to the setting, to suggest that the Imperium's history was vast and complex enough to contain secrets that would never be revealed. However, as Warhammer 40,000 evolved from a setting for tabletop games into a multimedia franchise with novels, video games, and extensive codices, the role of the Lost Primarchs began to shift. The Black Library's Horus Heresy series, in particular, started to add more details about them, dropping hints and references that gave them more substance than they had originally possessed. Stories like The Chamber at the End of Memory provided tantalizing glimpses of what might have happened while still preserving the fundamental mystery. This evolution has created tension between 2 competing approaches to the Lost Primarchs. On one hand, there is the original intent to leave them as an unknowable mystery, a deliberate gap in the lore that would never be filled. On the other hand, there is the natural desire of fans, and even some writers, to solve the puzzle, to provide answers to questions that have been hanging in the air for decades. The debate within the fan community reflects this tension. Some argue passionately that the Lost Primarchs should never be fully revealed, that solving the mystery would diminish it, that the power of the Lost Primarchs lies precisely in their unknowability. They point to the way that mysteries lose their allure once they are solved, how definitive answers can never be as interesting as the speculation and theorizing that precedes them. They worry that any concrete revelation about the Lost Primarchs would inevitably disappoint someone, that different fans have invested so much in their own theories that no single answer could satisfy everyone. Others argue that after decades of hints and references, the time has come for Games Workshop to provide real answers. They point out that the Horus Heresy series has revealed many previously mysterious elements of the lore, from the Emperor's conversations with Horus to the inner workings of the Mechanicum's highest councils. If those mysteries could be explored without diminishing the setting, why should the lost Primarchs remain off-limits? They argue that a well-crafted revelation could enhance, rather than diminish, the tragedy, that understanding what happened could make the Imperium's decision to erase them even more poignant. Games Workshop itself has seemed to walk a middle path. The company has added more details about the lost Primarchs over time, but always carefully, in ways that provide just enough information to fuel speculation without providing definitive answers. This approach allows them to have it both ways. The mystery remains unsolved, but there is enough substance to keep fans engaged and theorizing. From a narrative standpoint, the Lost Primarchs serve several important functions in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They remind us that the Imperium has existed for 10,000 years, and that much of its history has been lost or deliberately hidden. They demonstrate that even the greatest heroes and the most important figures can be completely erased from memory if those in power decide it is necessary. They show us that the Emperor was willing to make impossible choices, to sacrifice even his own sons if he deemed it necessary for humanity's survival. The Lost Primarchs also serve as a dark mirror to the Horus heresy. Where the traitor Primarchs are remembered and their treachery is documented, the Lost Primarchs have been forgotten. This suggests that the Imperium feared them more than it feared Horus, that whatever they represented was more dangerous than open rebellion. It implies that there are worse things than betrayal, failures more catastrophic than treason. Perhaps most importantly, the Lost Primarchs remind us that some questions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe will never be fully answered. This is a setting where truth is subjective, where history is propaganda, where the official story is always suspect. The existence of mysteries that cannot be solved, of gaps in the historical record that can never be filled, is essential to maintaining the grimdark atmosphere that defines Warhammer 40,000. In a way, the debate over whether the Lost Primarchs should ever be fully revealed is itself part of the mystery's appeal. The fact that fans care enough to argue passionately about it demonstrates the power of the concept. A mystery that no one cared about would not generate decades of speculation and theory crafting. The Lost Primarchs have become iconic precisely because they represent the ultimate unanswered question in a setting full of dark secrets. Modern implications and Belisarius' call. In the current era of Warhammer 40,000, 10,000 years after the Lost Primarchs were erased from history, their shadow continues to fall across the Imperium in unexpected ways. The most significant recent development involves Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, the brilliant and controversial tech priest who created the Primaris Space Marines. Call's work with Primarch Geneseed has inadvertently brought the Lost Primarchs back into relevance, raising questions that the Imperium thought were buried forever. Belisarius Call is not a typical tech priest. While most members of the Adeptus Mechanicus worship the machine and view innovation with suspicion, Call has spent 10,000 years secretly advancing technology and pushing the boundaries of what the Mechanicum considers acceptable. His greatest achievement, accomplished over millennia of patient work, was the development of the Primaris Space Marines, enhanced versions of regular Space Marines with superior physiology, additional organs, and more stable gene seed. To create the Primaris Marines, Call needed genetic samples from all of the Primarchs. And this is where things become interesting. Call did not limit himself to the 9 loyalist Primarchs, whose gene seed was still officially in use. According to the lore revealed in recent codices and novels, Call collected samples of the genomes of all 20 original Primarchs. This includes not just the 9 traitors who fell to chaos, but also the 2nd and 11th, the Lost Primarchs, who were supposed to have been completely erased from history. The fact that Call was able to obtain gene seed samples from the Lost Primarchs tells us several important things. First, it confirms that despite the thoroughness of their erasure, some genetic material from these Primarchs was preserved somewhere. Whether this was stored in the depths of the Imperial Palace, hidden in the vaults of Mars, or preserved through some other means, the complete biological legacy of the lost Primarchs was not destroyed. This makes sense from a practical standpoint. The Emperor may have ordered the erasure of all records and memories, but he would not necessarily destroy valuable genetic data that might someday prove useful. Second, it suggests that information about the lost Primarchs exists somewhere in the Mechanicum's archives, however restricted and encrypted it might be. Call would have needed more than just genetic samples. He would have needed information about how those samples related to the other Primarchs, what unique characteristics they possessed, and how they could be incorporated into his work. This information, by its very existence, contradicts the idea that the lost Primarchs were completely forgotten. When Reboot Guilliman returned from his millennia-long slumber in stasis and learned about Call's work, he was presented with a choice. Call had created Primaris gene lines derived from all 20 Primarchs, including the 9 traitors and the 2 lost brothers. The Archmagos argued that these gene lines were superior to the existing ones and that the Imperium should make use of all available resources, regardless of their origin. The warriors themselves were not flawed, only their Primarchs were. Guilliman's response was unequivocal. He refused to allow gene seed from the traitor Primarchs or the lost Primarchs to be put into mass production. Only gene seed from the 9 loyalist Primarchs would be used for creating new Primaris Marines. This decision has profound implications for how we understand the lost Primarchs and their legacy. The conversation between Guilliman and Call's proxy, the Call Inferior, is particularly revealing. When Guilliman insists that gene seed from the 11 rejected Primarchs cannot be used, the Call Inferior responds, "The warriors were not at fault. The science is not at fault. Their Primarchs were. Chapters from your gene line have also fallen in the past millennia, Lord Regent, and we do not censor them." This statement is loaded with meaning. First, it confirms what the chamber at the end of memory suggested. The Primarchs themselves were to blame for their disappearance, not their space marines. The genetic material itself is sound. It was something about the Primarchs as individuals that necessitated their removal. Second, it suggests that the problem was not purely genetic, because if the gene seed itself was flawed, Call would not have been able to use it successfully in his experiments. Guilliman's refusal to use the lost Primarch's gene seed is particularly interesting, because he was one of the 2 Primarchs who argued for preserving the lost legionaries after their Primarchs were erased. He knows better than almost anyone what really happened to his lost brothers, even if his memory of the details has been suppressed. His decision suggests that whatever befell them, he believes it was serious enough that their genetic legacy should not be perpetuated, even 10,000 years later. But Call's experiments raise another possibility. If the Archmagos was able to create viable Primaris Marines from the lost Primarch's gene seed, it implies that the genetic material itself is not inherently corrupted or flawed beyond use. This lends support to theories that the lost Primarch's failure was not primarily genetic, but circumstantial, ideological, or related to specific events, rather than fundamental biological defects. The existence of lost Primarch gene seed in Call's possession also opens up narrative possibilities that Games Workshop might or might not choose to explore. What if some Primaris Marines were secretly created from this gene seed? What if Call, being Call, decided to experiment with it regardless of Guilliman's prohibition? What if there are chapters of Primaris Marines serving the Imperium who carry the genetic legacy of the lost Primarchs without knowing it? These questions become more urgent when we consider the political and military situation of the 41st millennium. The Imperium is beset on all sides by enemies more numerous and powerful than ever before. The Great Rift has split the galaxy in 2. Chaos incursions are at their highest level since the Horus heresy, and Xenos threats, from the Tyranids to the Necrons, press in on all fronts. In such dire circumstances, Would the Imperium really refuse to use any available resource, including gene seed from the lost Primarchs? Guilliman's decision to forbid the use of this gene seed speaks to how seriously the transgression of the lost Primarchs is still viewed, even 10 millennia later. Despite the Imperium's desperate need for every possible warrior, despite Call's assurances that the genetic material is sound, Guilliman will not risk whatever danger the lost Primarchs represented. This suggests that the threat they posed was not simply military or even ideological, but something more fundamental, something that could undermine the Imperium itself even now. There is also the question of what Call knows or has discovered about the lost Primarchs through his work with their gene seed. As the most brilliant geneticist in the Imperium, and possibly the most knowledgeable being about Primarch biology outside of the Emperor himself, Call might have uncovered secrets about the 2nd and 11th that others have forgotten. He might understand why they failed, what flaws or capabilities made them too dangerous to preserve, and being Call, he might not share this information even with Guilliman, hoarding it as part of his vast accumulation of forbidden knowledge. The possibility that Call could reveal information about the lost Primarchs, either intentionally or through some disaster involving his experiments, creates narrative tension. In a setting where the return of Primarchs has become an increasingly important plot element, with Guilliman already returned and others potentially following, the spectre of the lost Primarchs gaining some form of renewed existence through Primaris Marines carries both promise and threat. Some fans speculate that Games Workshop might eventually use Call's possession of lost Primarch gene seed as a mechanism to introduce new Space Marine factions or reveal new information about these mysterious figures. A catastrophic failure in Call's laboratories might accidentally create warriors bearing the lost Primarch's genetic template, forcing the Imperium to confront what it thought it had buried forever. Or Call might deliberately create such warriors in defiance of Guilliman's orders, believing that the Imperium's survival justifies any risk. The modern implications of the lost Primarchs extend beyond just Call's experiments. In the current lore, the Imperium is more desperate and more willing to embrace radical solutions than it has been in millennia. The return of Guilliman has already broken numerous precedents, and the increasing flexibility in Imperial doctrine might eventually extend to reconsidering the absolute prohibition on anything related to the lost Primarchs. Whether this will actually happen remains to be seen. Games Workshop has shown itself willing to advance the Warhammer 40,000 timeline and reveal long-held mysteries in recent years. But the lost Primarchs remain one of the setting's most carefully guarded secrets. The fact that Call's work with their gene seed has been mentioned at all suggests that Games Workshop is at least keeping options open, but it does not necessarily mean that definitive revelations are forthcoming. In the end, the modern relevance of the lost Primarchs through Belisarius Call's work demonstrates that even the most thoroughly erased elements of history can echo through the millennia. The Emperor tried to completely remove the 2nd and 11th from existence, to erase even the memory of their names. But their genetic legacy survived in carefully preserved samples, waiting in vaults for someone brilliant and arrogant enough to use them. In a setting defined by the weight of history and the impossibility of ever truly escaping the past, this seems entirely appropriate. The lost Primarchs, like all ghosts, refuse to stay buried. Conclusion: the power of the unknown. We have journeyed through fragmentary evidence, explored multiple theories, and examined what little can be known about the lost Primarchs. We have stood before those empty pedestals in the Imperial Palace, traced the connections to the Rangdan Xenocides, considered the implications of genetic flaws and ideological divergence, and pondered the role of the Space Wolves as executioners. We have looked at how the surviving Space Marines might have been redistributed, examined the real-world reasons for the mystery's existence, and considered the modern implications of Belisarius Call's experiments with forbidden gene seed. And yet, after all this investigation and speculation, we are left with no definitive answers. We do not know the names of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs. We do not know exactly what they did or what befell them. We do not know whether they were killed, exiled, imprisoned, or destroyed in some other way. We do not know whether their failure was genetic, ideological, circumstantial, or some combination of factors. We have theories, well-supported and thoroughly argued theories, but theories nonetheless. This is not a failure of our investigation. It is the entire point. The Lost Primarchs exist as a mystery precisely because some things in the Warhammer 40,000 universe are meant to remain unknown. In a setting that has been developed over decades, with hundreds of novels and thousands of pages of codices and source material, the deliberate preservation of genuine mysteries is essential to maintaining the sense that this fictional universe is truly vast and ancient, that it contains depths that cannot be fully plumbed. The power of the Lost Primarchs, as a narrative element, lies not in what they were, but in what they represent. They represent the Imperium's willingness to erase its own history when truth becomes inconvenient or dangerous. They represent the terrible choices the Emperor was willing to make, destroying even his own sons when he deemed it necessary. They represent the fragility of memory and the malleability of history, the way that entire peoples and events can be wiped from existence if those in power decide it must be so. The Lost Primarchs also serve as a reminder that the Imperium of the 41st Millennium is built on lies and omissions as much as on truth. The official histories are propaganda designed to support the current power structure and maintain the faith of the masses. The gaps in those histories, the things that are not said, are sometimes more important than what is recorded. In a galaxy where ignorance is survival and knowledge can corrupt, the decision to completely forget certain truths might be the only way to preserve sanity and loyalty. For those of us who engage with Warhammer 40,000 as fans and enthusiasts, the Lost Primarchs represent the ultimate puzzle, a mystery that invites endless speculation and theorizing. Every new piece of lore is examined for hints about what might have happened. Every reference to the 2nd or 11th in the novels is dissected for hidden meanings. The community of theorists and speculators has created elaborate explanations, each supported by careful reading of the available evidence, each plausible within the flexible boundaries of the setting. This collective theorizing has become part of the experience of engaging with Warhammer 40,000. The Lost Primarchs are not just a narrative element within the fiction. They are a focal point for community engagement, a shared mystery that brings fans together in the pursuit of understanding. Whether Games Workshop ever provides definitive answers or maintains the mystery indefinitely, the Lost Primarchs have already succeeded in their purpose. They have created exactly the kind of deep, unknowable background that Rick Priestley envisioned when he first created them. If we step back and consider what the available evidence suggests, a picture emerges, however incomplete. The Lost Primarchs were found by the Emperor and reunited with their legions. They participated in the Great Crusade, fighting battles and conquering worlds like their brothers. They were involved in the Rangdan Genocides, one of the most terrible campaigns in Imperial history. And then something happened, something catastrophic enough that the Emperor personally decided they had to be completely erased from history. This erasure was not simple execution or condemnation. It was total historical obliteration, accomplished through the destruction of all records, the mind-wiping of witnesses, and the psychic suppression of memories even among the Primarchs themselves. The Space Marines of the Lost Legions were preserved but redistributed after their memories were altered. The gene seed was stored but forbidden from use. The truth was locked away in places like the chamber at the end of memory, preserved against the possibility that it might someday be needed, but hidden from all but a handful of beings in the entire Imperium. Whatever the Lost Primarchs did or became, it was considered more dangerous than the Horus Heresy itself. Rogel Dawn, having his memory temporarily restored, believed that their presence during the Civil War would have doomed the Imperium completely. This suggests that they represented a threat that went beyond simple military power or ideological corruption. They were something that the Imperium, even at its strongest, could not afford to confront or acknowledge. The tragedy of the lost Primarchs is multifaceted. There is the personal tragedy of two beings designed to be perfect, who somehow failed catastrophically. There is the tragedy of tens of thousands of Space Marines who had their identities stolen and their memories erased, who now serve under false pretenses without knowing what they have lost. There is the tragedy of the surviving Primarchs who knew their lost brothers and had to live with memories that would eventually be suppressed, forced to forget their own siblings. And there is the tragedy of an Imperium that believed erasing truth was preferable to confronting it, that chose historical fiction over historical fact. But there is also something almost inspiring in the absoluteness of the erasure. The Imperium went to extraordinary lengths to remove the lost Primarchs from history. It invested tremendous resources, violated its own principles about the sanctity of memory and truth, and created a conspiracy that has lasted for 10,000 years. This tells us that whatever the lost Primarchs represented, it was taken seriously enough to warrant measures that were never applied to anyone else, not even to Horus himself after his betrayal. In the final analysis, the lost Primarchs endure, not despite, but because of their unknowability. They are Schrödinger's tragedy, simultaneously all possible explanations and none of them. They are genetic failures and ideological heretics and Xenos corrupted abominations and something else entirely. They are forgotten and purged, erased and preserved, gone and somehow still present in the shadows of Imperial history. As we conclude this exploration of one of Warhammer 40,000's greatest mysteries, we are left with the same questions we started with, but perhaps with a deeper appreciation for why those questions exist. The lost Primarchs are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be contemplated. A gap in the historical record that reminds us that some truths are too dangerous to know and some failures too catastrophic to remember. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the lost Primarchs stand as monuments to the forgotten, warnings about the price of failure, and reminders that even the Emperor's most perfect creations could fall in ways that demanded they be erased from existence. Their empty pedestals in the Imperial Palace will remain vacant, their names will remain unspoken, and their fates will remain shrouded in the mystery that has defined them for 10,000 years. And perhaps, in a setting as dark and unforgiving as Warhammer 40,000, that is exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed diving deep into this mystery, please like and subscribe to Q on 40K. There are countless other secrets, theories, and dark corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe waiting to be explored. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, some questions are more valuable than their answers.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.